Hello, this is Dan with the Veterans for Peace Forum. I want to welcome you to our show today. I have a couple of guests here. I've got Douglas Lain, who is a publisher, Tor Books, a good friend of mine from many years now. He's here to discuss one of the new published books that they did, Kill All Normies by Angela Nagle. And there's a couple other books that he also brought, which is Edmund Berger, Uncertain Futures, An Assessment of the Conditions of the Present. These two books kind of go together. And then a third book by Mark Fisher, Capitalist Realism, There Is No Alternative. So I just wanted to bring that up in the beginning. And then my first guest is going to be Brooklynn Clark. Brooklyn's a Army veteran. Her military occupation was a specialist in electronic devices repair, secret level security clearance. You're based in Fort Jackson, South Carolina.
That's where I went to basic training.
And then you did duty in Fort Bliss, Texas?
Fort Bliss, I was attached to Air Defense Artillery Unit and supported them.
Okay. Now you're doing progressive work, weekly peer support group at the Q Center, creating trans and intersex centered events, and in the initial stages of forming a nonprofit designed to assist gender non-conforming people with housing, employment, and education. As a legal aid?
No, as founder.
As founder?
Yeah.
All right. And you said you work as
a support
paralegal?
I do work as a paralegal, not currently with an organization right now. Do freelance. Sometimes I work through temp agencies, sometimes with the government. It really depends on what work, what work I have available. You know, that's what pays the bills, but that's not where my heart's at. Really.
Okay.
And that's not the kind of work you do with your foundation or your organization?
Well, I use my paralegal skills to do structure, to build organizations. The way I look at the documents, the contracts, is structure. It's bones. It's you know, that's what I see. And so when I build these organizations, I want to make sure you kind of in paralegal school they taught us to build backwards. Like think of anything that could happen, and say if that happens, what do you do? And so that's kind of what I'm doing right now in the initial stages of business plans, bylaws, the board of trustees, and so forth like that, making sure all the checks and balances are in place.
Oh, that's great. We need more of that.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things we just had here, of course, is the May 26th is when the two young men were killed on the MAX train. And just after that, I was actually I went to Washington, D.C. for Memorial Day with Veterans for Peace, full disclosure campaign that we have there where we do letters to the wall. And I remember I got a call from Ari saying, "Hey, Dan, will you guys support this stand against," I was in the airport at the time, the stand against hate. And I said, sure, you know, Veterans for Peace would be a part of that. The interesting thing while I was in Washington, D.C., you know, we went to the wall, we put up these letters that we write and put them up on the wall. What was interesting and people that followed that, a lot of the young people that picked those letters up and read the stories and poetry and whatever person read, sat on the lawn and read those stories, which is really pretty powerful. I had one of our veterans who was with VFP and also with Vietnam Veterans Against the War, the earlier GI resistance movement, and he's in his wheelchair, and we come to a place on the wall where he saw names of the people, and he went through the names and started telling stories about each of these people that had died in his company. So it was real interesting to be there, and that he had those names and stories. For me, it was interesting because when I went back, I wrote a letter to a friend who I had served with in the Philippines, and he was getting ready to get married to a Filipino young woman, and then he got these orders to go back to Vietnam. And about a month later, we got word that he was killed. And I always knew him as Frank Garcia, and we were really, really close friends. And I, after that happened, a lot of things I didn't realize at the time, that I was so emotionally bothered by what had happened, that my post-traumatic stress, which we didn't have a name for at the time, came out, and I started not to be cooperative with what was going on, refused to go on post, all kinds of things that happened that ended me up in the brig eventually, But for years I've been trying to find him on the wall, because I remember looking for names once they had a website up and they started seeing this, and I could never find his name, Frank Garcia. I looked at Marines who had served together at certain times, and finally, here just a while ago, before going back there, I got online again, and I saw these names that I started going through, and I found two people that looked like him. They had pictures of people up there. And one of them had in his middle name was Falcone, so I thought, well, that could be Frank. The other was, what was it? I can't remember his first name anymore, but it was not Frank. It was like Jose or something, Garcia, and but the picture looked identical to him, and he may have just used the nickname Frank, when we were there. So I wrote a letter. Is it you? Is it you, Frank? Yeah. And I went through this little thing on how I missed him and what it meant to me. So it was very emotional for me to be back there. Then after that, we went to the Martin Luther King Memorial, and there we did the reading of Martin Luther King's Beyond Vietnam speech. A minister, Lain Hagler, spoke, and the first thing he spoke about to bring these things together was to talk about what had just happened in Portland, Oregon. And I'm going, yeah, this is incredible. So that was one thing that really got to me, that he brought up the idea of this violence that's taking place, and we as Veterans for Peace, and he brought that all together about not just violence, but in Martin Luther King's statement is about is about materialism, militarism, and racism, as those three components. And today we would add probably environmentalism, because with climate change that we're dealing with. So those are really important statements that he made that are so pertinent today. One of the things you might tell us a little bit about, when you came and you spoke at the Stand Against Portland, that was on June 4th at City Hall on a Sunday at 4 p.m. And across the street we had sort of the alt-right rally that was almost an insult at the time, that after these murders that took place, they called this rally together, and then there was a call to bring people out. And from what I understand, as I was reading some material from people, that there was a certain critique from some of the family members, one of the family members, who didn't even want us to do the event. And so people were deciding whether they would or would not do it. It was called off at one time, and then came back together and said, well, what is this? What is this this act of violence, this act that murdered two young people who stood up to somebody who, and there was a third person who was also stabbed and survived. What is going on in our society? Was this some crazy? Was this somebody that came out of white supremacist movement? Did he have problems to begin with? What led to this killing? And at the same time, the idea of bringing out an alt-right sort of demonstration, almost supportive of what happened in a sense. I'm not sure that I would call it supportive, but the idea that they came here to face the so-called liberals of Portland, Oregon. Mm-hmm. And what I wonder is, to me, it's like terrorism. Terrorism was to say people were afraid to come out to the event. So that's when terrorism is successful. That's when people are silent. And we said, no, we're not going to be silent. We're going to come out there and give whatever kind of feelings that we had about what had happened and why we were there. For me, as a Veterans for Peace, I'm always dealing with the military and bases that are being done across the world and standing up against, the whole military-industrial complex. But we have a motto with Veterans for Peace, which is peace at home and peace abroad. We're very supportive of the Black Lives Matter movement. We take a look at what's happening in our local communities. How can we build peace in the world if we're not building peace at home? So we want to address those issues, and we're not going to be frightened away, by these things. So that's one of the reasons I was there. So I want you to talk about a little bit about why you were there and what you had to say.
Sure. So I was there because one of the main organizers, Nico, asked me to speak. I met Nico through a community effort that we did back in, I want to say, November. It was Trans HIV Testing Day, worldwide really, and so we wanted to have an event where we can test people for STIs and HIV, especially in the transgender community. And so it was a lot of community organizations that came together, medical professionals that came together. We had workshops. We had space for sex workers and people of color and Two-Spirit, and it was a really nice event. So I met Nico through that event, and they asked me if I would speak at the Portland Stands Against Hate, and I thought that would be really nice. I thought that at first I was scared to go to this thing because I knew I knew what the temperature was like in the city of Portland and really, nationwide, worldwide right now. A couple of things that you said, what caused it, and I think it was everything that you mentioned. A friend of mine wrote on Facebook recently, there's been stuff going on in Europe, and they said another Muslim attack, and I had to speak up and said that's not a Muslim attack. That's a terrorist attack, and it happens. Muslims do it, and Christians do it, and white people do it, and black people do it, and we all. The point of my speech was that we use guns, knives, words, religion to hurt each other, as opposed to using them to support and help one another, or using these things responsibly and for the right purposes. These tools, really, that we use to hurt one another: cars, trucks, guns, knives, planes, religion. If we're sophisticated creatures, human beings are, then why do we find ways to use anything really to harm one another? And so that's what I spoke about, while the other side was saying why other people are less than. What I thought, the perspective that I came with as a veteran that has friends, you've lost friends, is that how or when, I guess, are people going to evolve? I think the people that lost their lives and that got stabbed on the train were evolved human beings. They were standing up for values, for humanity, for people to just be. And as a trans woman of color, I just a lot of times just want to be able to live and just be. And so I had to go to that rally, even though I was scared, and just speak my thoughts. Yeah.
Yeah, when we were there, I know when I was looking out over the crowd, it was like I saw thousands in front of us, and I didn't realize that there was actually labor on the other side, and then there was, of course, in Chapman Square, we had the anti-fad on the other side, and so they were really surrounded by this whole thing. In some ways, I wonder, this is what they want too. In some ways, they want that confrontation, they want that press, they want us to be there. And some people are saying let's just ignore them so they didn't get that kind of press. But there's something in me that says I can't just be silenced by this stuff, So I had to be there. While I was talking, actually, it was the flashbang grenades started going off. They interrupted what I was talking about. But one of the things that and then we went on, and all of a sudden, a little bit of flashback. You know, when you hear flashbang, that brings back that whole military experience. I felt as though maybe I'm standing back in Vietnam, and mortars are going off, guns are going off. It took just a second to bring me back and realize and to go on. But since I'm a vet, and you're a vet, I kind of want to get into the idea also about, veterans in the military. I mean, when I was in the military, racism was a big thing. There was a lot of racism. In Okinawa, there was actually, just before going to Vietnam, there was a African-American riot. They would call it a riot, I'd call it an uprising at the time. And I didn't know what it was about. I was caught in the middle of the whole thing. And luckily I was drunk. People surrounded me, and somebody took a swing at me, and I fell on the ground, but really never touched me. I just faking it. And a bunch of people around me were pretending like they were kicking me, but they never kicked me. And then all of a sudden I hear the MP's whistle go off, right? And all of a sudden people scattered, and this guy, I wore glasses at the time, and so this guy picks up, a black soldier picks up my glasses, puts them on, says, "You better get out of here." And the MPs came, and they go, "You're under arrest for starting a riot." And I said, "What? What are you talking about?" So they go over to that truck there, so they had a paddy wagon there, and I walked over there, but they didn't know what was going on when I went there. I said, "Hey, what's up?" And he said, "Hey, there's a riot going on. You better get out of here." "Okay, I'm leaving." And I took off and got back. So I got out of there, but the thing is I didn't know why it happened or what it was about. Then years later, I look back, and there were a number of uprisings throughout the United States, and so it's very interesting to see, again, what we're dealing with at that time, police violence and the community under extreme oppression, and then people were uprising. So these issues continued not only in the communities, but in the military. And the military has this aspect, you're not a person of color, we're all green in the military, ambulance and the Marines, so we're all green. And yet they had these various sections. Even in Vietnam, though we would consider ourselves equal with each other, often people of color were put to the task of cleaning the toilets and actually burning the waste, while other people didn't have to do that. So you saw that. One of the things that bothered me about being in the military from the very beginning, from boot camp to going to Vietnam, was the denigration of Vietnamese and the continually using all these racist terms. I was opposed to racism at the time, and those kinds of things already had me thinking against what we were doing there. When I finally got out of the military, for me, I didn't say anything for years until, as a veteran, I got involved in human rights work and sanctuary work and labor work, and always dealing with these issues, but I never spoke as a veteran until 1991 when Herbert Walker Bush, with number one, drew the line in the sand, and then all of a sudden the shock and awe took place, and it triggered all kinds of buttons, and that's when I started speaking out as veterans. And years later, in about 2004, VFP and I found each other, and I've been with them ever since. So this has become one of the things that, I saw what war did to people. I saw how the war came back and still affects you as a human being. You were in the military. One of the things I really don't know why I joined sometimes, 19 years old, you're not the wisest kid in the world. So my question to you is, why did you join? Did you come to a place in your life and when you became or had an epiphany, you said, this is wrong? And you tell us about that.
Sure. So I joined the military, honestly, because growing up, I had a rough upbringing. I didn't have support at home, and I wanted to be on my own. And I believe somewhere inside of me, I knew that I was trans. and I kind of wanted to untrans myself. I wanted to make myself like a guy. So I went to the military to try to like fix myself and get away from home, and so I thought that was a good choice, and have a career and get an education and all the stuff to tell you when you go to a recruiter. I joined in March of 2001, and September happened in 2001 with the towers, and I'm from New York. I have family in New York and Jersey, and so that was a big thing for my family. I remember that we were in advanced technical training, learning how to fix these special electronic devices that I had the special clearance for. And I remember the drill sergeants and the teachers didn't come back. And I remember like it was yesterday because I'm the curious one, and so of course we were like taking our break in the courtyard or what have you, and I went into the lounge where the NCOs and the officers were at, and I was like, are we gonna have class or what's going on? And they were just like watching TV, and I was like, what is this? Like, is this a Godzilla movie or King Kong? Like, what are you watching? Like, what is this? And they're like, no, we're under attack, you know. And I remember we had the formation after that, and I remember most of the people in my training unit, we got our orders changed. I was supposed to go to the NTC in California, Fort Irwin, but they changed me to Fort Bliss so that I could support air defense artillery in preparation for war. And again, to come to where we're at today, with ISIS and things like that. It seems like, I don't know, I mean, you brought me on this show to get my perspective.
Right.
As a transgender person,
Yeah.
as a person of color, and even to talk about the mental health stuff.
Yeah.
And I think, again, like bombing the hell out of each other back and forth is not helping it's not advancing humanity. As a person of color, I think that most of the time it's us that are the enlisted people that have to go to wars. Our president, I don't even want to say his name, dodged. He didn't want to go. He went to military school. He had all the best training in the world, but he didn't want to go. But he has no problem sending other people's kids to go. And I think the evidence of that is the first mission where we lost someone because of his planning at his golf course. I think that as a transgender person, I feel happy that people can serve openly in the police force and in the military, and I think that some people are reformers and they go into these occupations to change the culture and to police the police, if you will. I think that as a person of color, the prison industrial complex, the military industrial complex don't really help people of color. Not in this country, not all over the world. And so if we're going to try to see people as equal, then it doesn't seem fair that all the officers are white people with college educations and all the enlisted people are people of color that are on the front lines and losing their lives. I think, I was supposed to speak at the Trans March about mental health. I didn't for reasons I don't want. For reasons I don't want to go into right now. But my research showed me that what the professionals are calling mental illness really seems to be natural reactions that the mind does to protect us from trauma, from poverty, from stress. I grew up as a kid in a pretty rough household. I was abused physically, verbally, emotionally. I don't really have much of a family, especially after transitioning. And so anxiety and depression are pretty, you could kind of like foresee that would be something that somebody with the challenges that I have would have. If you lose buddies in combat, and you see things that you can't unsee, post-traumatic stress is what you could foresee a human being that has feelings would have, you know. So I don't really think that our minds are ill. I think that the stuff that's going on out there is
ill.
pretty sick.
That's right.
You know, and we're just trying to deal with it the best that we can as human beings. And so, you know, my position as a transgender woman of color is that we all need to, you know, see eye to eye and see that we're all human beings. Everybody, you know, nobody's better than anybody else. We're all human beings, and we need to work together. That's how I feel.
That's
Yeah.
good. Yeah. Well, that's. Did you have? You know, of course, I talked to you before, and I said you should join Veterans for Peace. Right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
I love to have you locally here, but also internationally. You know, we have chapters now in London and Ireland, Okinawa. We have for deported veterans down in Mexico and Tijuana. We just had and we of course we have veterans in Vietnam, but we just recently had a Japanese chapter, a Japanese soldier startup. So that just happened here in June. So that's I think announced on the 9th. So really powerful to see that people around the world, veterans who had served in military combat or combatants of one form or another, coming out and speaking against it. Have you ever seen Sir No Sir?
No.
Okay,
No.
this is about the Vietnam GI resistance movement.
Okay.
So even while people were serving in the military, they were part of a resistance movement within the military, and people were involved in underground papers and resisting what was happening. People went to jail. Again, people of color who resisted spent more time in jail than whites that were arrested and put in jail. Then there were, of course, people that went AWOL and deserted from the military. Same thing happened with the Iraq War. You know, there are a number of people that were part of that GI resistance movement here. A lot of them actually, the starting up of Iraq Veterans Against the War, got their message a lot from Sir No Sir, and studying that history of people. It talks about the peace movement, the veterans that came back and got involved in the peace movement and did what they call Winter Soldier. Winter Soldier, taking their medals that they'd received and throwing them over to the White House. You know, they refused to accept that as something. They were opposing the war, what they called Dewey Canyon 3. So there was this incredible film that is still out there, and I think that's something that people should see. People, if they want to do that, it is online. You can look up Sir No Sir, just Google it and bring it up. You can either purchase it or I believe much of the show is online. There's something else I just wanted to let people know. With Veterans for Peace, we have a newspaper called Peace in Our Times. This is the paper, Peace in Our Times. This is comes out monthly. And if you want to, just go to Veterans for Peace, and you can find out about Peace in Our Times. This is a story here. We have delegations that go to various places. I was on a delegation 2015 to Okinawa. That was the beginning of that chapter in Okinawa. In opposing the people there, the Okinawans were opposing military bases in Okinawa. And there's much going on right now. There's a film being made of one of the resistors who had been jailed for a while, and we just, got him out. And he's going to be speaking before the UN. There's, in this paper here, there was a delegation that went to Palestine. And a number of people that were in there were, when they went to areas where people were occupying the land and the settlements, some of our members were actually hit by them, really attacked by them. So, I mean, at times the Israeli Defense Forces actually fired live weapons at their feet or rubber bullets. So it's if you want to find out more about it, that would be something to do. I just met somebody here in Portland who's also came here, used to work with drones, and he'll talk to I'll hopefully have him on a program next time, so we can have him talk about what post-traumatic stress is. Even when you're removed from the war, you're a participant in it, and when you realize that, you know, your missiles from a drone can kill innocent families. You know, there's not the same thing as a trauma of seeing somebody killed, but there's something else that happens, and that's also that happens to both, is we call moral injury. Your consciousness has been attacked, and you begin to say, what is right, and it goes against all your instincts to say, you know, we are all human beings, and what are we doing, killing women and children? So those are important things, I think, for people to understand. I want to get into Doug here. Doug's book, Doug is a publisher with Zero Books, as I mentioned before. We go back to college days, and he was a journalist or editor with Vanguard newspaper in Portland State University.
Journalist or opinion writer.
Yeah, and so we had met there.
And now I'm also a novelist, you should mention that.
Yeah, well, Doug is, I actually even did a cover for one of your books.
You did.
But therefore I'm an artist.
He's an artist, yeah.
Doug Lain is publisher of Zero Books, a novelist, a blogger, a podcaster. His first novel, entitled Billy Moon, tells the story of Christopher Robin Milne's fictional involvement with the French general strike in May of 1968, and was released by Tor Books in August 27th, 2013. A great book. I really enjoyed it. Very nostalgic in a lot of ways.
For a time
but it was a time loop. It goes back to Star Trek, right? No, there's a private joke from second book, entitled After the Saucers Landed, is about Fluxus artists and ufologists who sink into the deep depression after the aliens arrive on schedule. Lain's first podcast, entitled Diet Soap, ran for over 5 years. And I'm glad to have him on the program. We've had him on before. The most recent book being published is Kill All Normies by Angela Nagle, Online Cultural Wars from 4chan and Tumblr to Trump and the alt-right. And since we were just talking about the stand against, since we were talking about stand against hate, she gives a pretty good critique upon the whole outline, and I want you to talk about it. There's a lot of names here. You know, it's not my world. There's a generation gap, and I'm not a
couple, Dan.
Yeah,
couple generations.
Couple generations. Where there are many names that she's talking about that I don't know. Doug's mentioned to me while we're drinking a beer, so I don't usually pay attention to when he's talking, so so I don't remember those names.
That explains a lot.
But you want to talk to us about this book and what it's about?
Well, you know, Kill All Normies is kind of a controversial book because what it does is it tries to explain the whole context around the alt-right. So it doesn't only examine the alt-right. Angela Nagle has a sociology degree. She's a doctorate actually in sociology. I forget exactly what she has a PhD in, but I think it's sociology. She did her dissertation on online culture. So this sort of came out of that dissertation. But it's not exclusively about the alt-right, although in the media these days she's like touted as the expert on the alt-right, but that's not really what she's focusing on. What she's focusing on is a culture, which I would say a culture of individualism, a culture that's anti-political or apolitical culture, a call-out culture, and a troll culture that's mostly online, but that has bled into the real world. So she talks about how what this all is a symptom of, really, and how, in fact, you can't really isolate the alt-right from, say, the call-out culture of social justice. Not that social justice is defined by that, but there's a certain kind of call-out culture, say on Twitter or on Tumblr, where what is most important is targeting individuals for their for violating the norms or for violating some sort of rule around how they speak or what they think or what they argue. And so the alt-right kind of lives on top of, like a parasite, on top of this call-out culture. And it's done this very well over the last 4 years or so, to such an extent that now it's its own little cottage industry on YouTube. You can make a living, and certain people do, just by taking up moments, scandals, flame wars, video footage of protests, video footage of lectures being shouted down, and editing it together and pointing and laughing. Basically, you can just make, like, through clicks and advertising revenue from YouTube, some people make a living at this. So that's what the book is about, but it's also more deeply about the way that we've turned away from actual politics, and especially turned away from a vision of a social transformation, or the way I'll put it more directly, from socialism, towards this idea that all that matters is policing the culture, changing the culture, changing people's individual attitudes or even our collective attitudes. So she's calling for a materialist politics, a politics that actually wants to go out and reshape the world and change our basic relations. And, from the left, that would mean changing the way that people work and produce and reproduce their world. In other words, there's sort of a revolutionary socialist vision that's behind her work, to varying degrees.
Well, talk a little bit about the culture. I mean, there are some things here we were talking about earlier where, like I said when we were talking earlier about there were the hacker movements in the early days, and then there was a group of people that were sort of pranksters in the very beginning. They would hack and they would also prank people. They get in their face about things. Again, as a sort of anti-establishment sort of thing, but people didn't find the jokes all that funny, And
she does a really great job, and I wish I remembered all the instances or examples that she gave in her book. But one of the things that I'm older than Angela Nagle by probably much more than a decade. It's very sad for me. But she starts in 2008 in her book. I have been online since the early 90s. At the time, I thought I was a late adopter, but apparently not. And there have been trolls online since early days, Usenet. I interviewed a guy who became internet famous in 1993 for being the king of the trolls on Usenet. He had written a script where he would track down anytime someone had mentioned his name on any news group and then pop up and make a comment. And at the time, that was some sort of technological miracle to know when someone had mentioned you. I mean, of course, now you go on Twitter, you just type in your name, and you can find anybody who's mentioned you anywhere in the world. But at the time, he had to write a special script for it, and he called himself an internet god, and his name was James Kibbo Perry. Kibbo is his self-adopted nickname, and he would used to go in and bother people in Mensa by asking stupid questions, like intentionally dumb questions for the geniuses to answer. And he was a troll. He would go into these groups and purposely antagonize them in an insincere way, and that's trolling. And so that's part of the alt-right now, the idea that you go in and maybe you talk about Hitler just to get people to be upset, or you violate this norm or that norm just to get people to be upset. And it's a long-standing tradition on the internet. It's unfortunately become less and less satirical over time. And there's this idea of moving the Overton window where ideas that were verboten before can now be expressed. So if you go to YouTube again, you can find out-and-out anti-Semitic comments on almost any YouTube video. It's like amazing. You'll find a kitten video and someone will write down with the Jews underneath it. And, at this point, it's not even a joke anymore. It's just kind of scary. So that's something that's talked about in this book as well.
Right. She was he was talking about also the author of this book here.
Talked about Mark Fisher.
Fisher, yeah.
Yeah, now Mark Fisher, he was not a victim of right-wing trolls. He wasn't a victim of anyone really, but he was attacked viciously by people on the left and people on the far left on Twitter for writing a piece called Exiting the Vampire Castle. He also is the author of this book, Capitalist Realism, and which is probably what put him on the map back in 2009.
And he passed away?
He died in January.
Yeah.
He took his own life, actually, in January, but at the age of 48. And I don't know the whole story there. He used to work at Zero Books before I started. His team left Zero Books in 2014, and I started right after. I knew him, I talked to him a few times, but because of that split, we weren't close after that.
Yeah.
But yeah, Mark wrote a really interesting piece that a friend of mine published in an online journal called The North Star. It was called Exiting the Vampire Castle, and it was a piece written against the call-out culture, saying, look, we are vicious to each other. We are always looking for an infraction. We have to have a broader vision. We should bring class back in to the picture, and we should talk about overcoming what oppresses us rather than figuring out who's the most oppressed in a particular group. That was about 3 years ago that he wrote that, and people didn't like him for calling them vampires. They got mad at the metaphors he used. They got mad at a lot of what he wrote, and it got very vicious online. In fact, some people, he was doxxed. Some people called the police and said that he was neglecting his children, and falsely said that about him, and the police checked him out. He was harassed. And even after he died, people on Twitter were saying, well, there goes another misogynist, or there goes another racist, or what have you. But he was actually a far leftist. He was a kind of socialist and a real fighter for equality and justice and for a better society.
So what's this book about here?
Capitalist Realism?
Yeah.
Capitalist Realism is a book about culture. It's a book about the culture of defeat. It's a book about living in a world in which you can more easily imagine the end of the world than you can a social transformation and the end of capitalism.
Hold that up so people can see that too. Yeah,
That's
there we go.
Capitalist Realism. Yeah. So this is a great book. It just keeps selling and selling. It's been one of our best sellers since 2009, and it really speaks to the experience of living in today's society, the experience of feeling like all real possibility of radical or revolutionary change has been closed off. And with the aim of after explaining the experience, the aim of trying to open the door to that radical transformation, at least in our minds. Another book, the other one I gave you, Uncertain Futures. Mm-hmm. This book is the one that is closest to my heart. It's not getting enough attention. This is like Angela Nagle's book does an analysis of the culture of the online culture wars and a culture of individualism, hyper-individualism, and a loss of radical political vision. That's the cultural analysis. This book talks about the kind of conditions behind that. Like, what are the problems? Like, it starts, instead of starting in 2008 with the election of Obama, it starts in 2007 with the economic crisis, and talks about how contradictions within the capitalist economic system set up booms and busts and booms and depressions, which have tremendous political and cultural effects. So these two books really ought to go together, although often enough people look at these books together. So both are good. But this is a very interesting book, and it's trying to figure out how to understand the Bernie Sanders phenomenon, how to understand the Trump phenomenon as arising from the same economic contradiction.
Mm-hmm. So, going back to Angela Nagle's book,
Yeah.
she also talking about people who were sort of critics of the left, and then we're there's sort of people who were attacking them for speaking out. They're trying to deal with looking at the failures of the left at a certain level, and then they would be put in the category of they weren't being politically correct.
Like Mark Fisher. You're
Yes.
talking about.
Okay. Yeah. So that kind of thing,
Uh-huh.
and then this sort of backlash. Politically correct, the word itself has has a lot of meaning to it. So
This is something we should talk about, actually,
yeah.
all of us, because
Let's-
the real danger for someone like Mark Fisher, and I've seen it happen to people on the left, is, I mean, it didn't happen to him. He continued writing. He continued to be very dedicated to social transformation and socialism. But the danger is that when you start down the road of critiquing political correctness or call-out culture, there's a whole industry waiting for you. Like at Evergreen, this guy, Brett Weinstein, have you heard about this? He's a professor at Evergreen who the students called him out because he didn't like a particular equality measure that had been instituted at the university or at the college. There was something called a day of absence that had been going on since the 70s, where every year the people of color would leave campus to kind of demonstrate how vitally important they were to the campus. It had come out of a play called The Day of Absence, where that happened in a small town miraculously, or, the white people at first thought it was a miracle. All the black people were gone, and then nothing worked, right? The whole city, the whole town started to fall apart, and they're like, nothing's getting cleaned up, nothing's getting done. It was like a general strike. And so that's what the Day of Absence was at Evergreen. The students of color would leave. This year, though, they decided maybe instead of us leaving, the white people should leave. And Brett didn't like that idea, didn't see the point of it. I'm not sure what my position is on it. I haven't thought about it very deeply. But his rejecting that idea brought some students on his head, and they called for his resignation. They protested him during a class. This was videotaped, or no tape was involved. I'm so old. It was videoed on a phone and then put on YouTube. It went viral, and now Brett Weinstein's making the rounds to Tucker Carlson and to Joe Rogan. He's not a far right winger, but still he's part of this anti-PC circuit. To a guy named Gad Saad, to another podcast video, Dave Rubin. He's making the rounds on the anti-PC circuit. And all of this is going to do is it pushes this narrative that the problem is the left. The problem is the regressive left, the way leftists are really secretly statist authoritarians, and they want to suppress you and they want to get at you. It pushes this narrative forward, and it works to get especially younger white guys to really get filled up with anger and enjoy kind of experiencing the consuming this image of call-out culture. And the really sad thing is the call-out culture is there, and it's often pretty awful. So anyway, that's something to discuss.
Well, I like in the end of her book, he says, the joke's not funny anymore.
Yeah,
and,
on either side. It's not funny.
And but we should go a little bit into the alt-right. Talk a little bit, about. We don't have too much time left, but I wanted to.
I wanted to hear, because Brooklynn you're working to fight hate and discrimination.
Yeah.
And I just want to hear what you think of, what I just said, and
Sure.
to get some feedback from that.
Yeah, no, I definitely heard and understood what you said, and I think that I think that it was really horrible what happened to Mr. Fisher.
Yeah.
Because language is artful. With a background in paralegal, a good writer wants to paint a picture with words.
Yeah.
And so I think that was really artful to call people vampires. And they got the picture.
Yeah, right.
Right? And so I think that it's really, as far as political correctness, I think we should be respectful of one another and not intentionally try to hurt one another. But at the same time, I think that when you are so politically correct that you don't know what the person's talking about, right? Because they're dancing around.
How do we work on addressing this without feeding in to hatred? Because it does. See, when,
Sure.
this really happens. Where you start talking about the call-out culture, and people use that to end up
I understand.
saying,
It's happened to me, totally.
Yeah.
And I think I'm from New York, and so being on the West Coast, it's a little different. People's feelings are more important than the substance of the conversation a lot of times.
Yeah.
And so that, to me, feeds into that kind of culture, because if you say, oh, that person is racist, sexist, a bigot, whatever, that tarnishes their reputation.
Right.
And on the West Coast, that's really, really bad to be one of those things.
Right.
Yeah, right. But
In New York, it's every day,
On
I
the
guess.
East Coast, you could say "F out of here," and it's not because you're black, you're a woman, you're whatever. It's just I don't really like you. Get out of my face,
Right.
But because you can't just tell people directly what it is, on the East Coast, there are people that are racist, and they might call you the N-word, but you know where they stand, and it is what it is.
Right.
I think that we have to talk to each other.
Right.
And so if we don't talk to each other because we're too worried that we're going to offend somebody, we never have the conversation.
Yeah.
I would rather people's feelings get hurt. We drink a beer, we dry our eyes, and we continue talking.
Yeah.
Is my opinion about it,
Yeah,
really.
yeah.
I think we're becoming very sensitive.
Yeah.
Well,
It was-
that raises the question
Yeah.
of free speech. The whole thing that the
can,
alt-right was
sure.
free speech.
And
so-
they were using it,
Yes.
and then the way they thought was useful.
Yeah.
What I was saying was
Yeah.
that they're really actually just wasting their breath, really, and they were. I mean, like you said, they were covered by three sides
Right.
of people that said hate doesn't win in this town. We have a drone video, and it shows their little march with nobody there, their rally,
Right.
and totally, surrounded by peaceful protesters.
Yeah.
And the police had to escort them out of there so they can get out of there safely.
Was that protest actually called after this guy killed us?
Oh, yeah.
Or was it called before and happened to fall right after?
I don't
That's
know, but
that's
I
a good
know
question.
that the mayor.
I know the mayor
called
wanted
for it
to
wanted to end it,
Yeah.
and the ACLU said this is freedom of speech.
Yeah.
And
Well,
I think
and he
that-
couldn't either because that was
it's
also
federal land.
Federal
It's federal
land.
land.
Yeah.
And as a former soldier, we fought for this Constitution.
Yeah.
We want freedom of speech, but at the same time, people don't get to yell, fire, in a crowded building.
Right.
There's limits to free speech, and so I think that's what we're doing as a
Yeah.
culture right now. What are the limits? And the only way you know is to test them.
I know. Yeah. Well, I mean, it really frustrates me every time the far right gets to hold a free speech rally, because first of all, none of those people care at all about free speech as a principle. You just to watch them; they don't care about it. But they use it because we let them use that issue against us, and it.
Okay. I mean, what are you going to do? Are you going to change the Constitution? Do you think we should change the
No,
Constitution?
no.
Yeah.
I want to keep free speech,
Yeah.
but I want to say the left needs to and we need to embrace free speech. It's ours. It's not theirs.
Absolutely.
It's we're able to talk about anything and debate without getting it at each other's throats.
Mm-hmm.
We should have that idea. I'm with you on that. So yeah, no, I want to keep the Constitution. I want a climate and a culture of free speech. And the right pretends to be about free speech, but look how they're interrupting this what the Shakespeare play in the park.
Sure. Yeah.
Was it King Lear?
Yeah.
Caesar. Anyway, the point is that they don't care about it. We should embrace it, but it's an uphill struggle, and people feel afraid. People are very scared, I think. I'll shut up.
I'm too scared.
Dan especially is scared.
Well, I mean, the thing is we're talking about this, is that these things have gone into the real world. They, as I said, bled into the real world. And where people would be anonymous online, they could say whatever they wanted and threatening people. I mean, even one part where a guy's child had died, and people would
Oh, yeah.
would troll him and say, "Oh, I'm a ghost, and knock on. I'm at your front door, and I'm your son or whatever, and
Yeah,
just let me in." You know, I mean, these cruel sort of jokes that people are doing.
They had posted a memorial to their dead son online, and they had misspelled something, or they had done something a little off, and so they were mercilessly mocked. Yeah, it's a terrible story, but it's in this book.
Yeah. So I mean, that's the thing. You start running into this thing. We've got about 3 minutes left, so you have a few.
I just was going to throw something out there. Trolling is not anything new
No.
with our, with our history. I thought about Martin Luther King again, and I remember when I would watch it. Yeah, I mean, but I remember the phone calls. And the endless phone calls that they got, and the threatening, the throwing the bombs, the Mazel Tov cocktails in the house, and so trolling and terror is nothing new, and so the purpose is to impede free speech, right? It is to make people scared, and so I think that you're right. We have to reclaim it and understand that it's not theirs. They're trying to say that it's theirs. And the last thing I want to say is, as a Christian, I believe that these are inalienable rights that are endowed by our Creator, our freedom of speech, or religion, or whatever we believe. And so we should be free to have them for everybody. For Muslims, for Christians, for blacks, for whites.
Amen.
Everybody. Hallelujah. That's all I have to say.
Any last words, Doug?
No, I think that's great. That's a good way to put it. I mean, I get told that I'm a free speech essentialist, and that it's a religious thing for me. I'm glad you said that and not I. But yeah, I feel pretty much in sentiment the same way. So
Shut up.
All right.
No, I just want to say this program is about people coming out and voicing their concerns about what's going on in our community. I think we need alternative media so that people have an opportunity to discuss these things openly and publicly. I want to support all progressive alternative media, like KBOO radio station here in Portland, that allows people to come and speak, and authors that come and bring these kind of discussions to the forefront. But we need more of these discussions in our schools and in our universities, where people can really sit down and have a safe space to talk about. We don't have to agree. We just need to begin to talk about these things so we can start moving forward. Again, I'm Dan Shea with Veterans for Peace, local chapter 72. If you're a veteran, please get involved. You can contact our national chapter, spelled out, Veterans for Peace, veteransforpeace.org, and you can find out about full disclosure and many other things that we're involved in. I want to thank everybody for being here. Thank you both for being here.